go ahead and hit record now. We're asking presenters to effectively give just a brief introduction so that we don't mispronounce anyone's names or misstate who they are. So if you would introduce yourself, and then the floor is yours.
Sure. My name is Melanie Sartore-Baldwin. I'm an associate professor at East Carolina University. My primary focus of research is non-human animals in sport and physical activity. I've done quite a bit with physical activity with a service learning class I do out at our local animal shelter, where the dogs walk, or the students walk the shelter dogs for academic credit. So just trying to find a way to enhance animals' lives as best we can here in Eastern North Carolina. So thank you for taking time out of your Saturday afternoon on a holiday weekend to attend this. I really appreciate it. So my presentation, Non-Human Animals in Sport, Are We any closer to recognizing their plight? What I wanted to look at specifically is non-human animal sport mascots. I feel like that's, it's an opportunity to tap into something with sport fans that I think we're overlooking. And so I wanted to take a closer examination of that. And I've done a couple other things with this same topic. So I'll refer to that at the end of the presentation. So there's lots of different ways to study non-human animals in society. Some of the ways I've looked at specifically, I've used animal standpoint theory, anthroparchy, interspecies model of prejudice, and social identity model of interspecies dominance. What I've used today is primarily focused around anthroparchy, to some extent animal standpoint theory, but the conclusions actually relate a great deal to some of the more recent theoretical models having to do with social identity and how animals may in fact actually be part of the in-group, could be. So in sport and physical activity, we know that animals are participants. Their bodies are used for a multitude of equipment, for feeding spectators. Likenesses are used for mascots. They have live mascots at certain arenas, which is what was on the opening screen. That was Arkansas. So they're also part of how we spend our leisure and recreation time. A great deal of our time is spent with our animals. A great deal of our discretionary income is spent on our animals. And so it's an undeniable fact that they are an integral part of our lives. Within sport and physical activity, there's lots of different ways to also examine the way in which animals have become so prominent in our lives. And this is just a short list of some of the ones that exist in the literature. The social justice approach, which is the approach I tend to adopt. And this relies upon things such as social connection, interrelatedness, and it really speaks to the way in which humans are violent. We exploit these animals, we dominate them, and we use them for our own purposes. There's also the ethics and moral rights approach, legal rights. Hegemonic masculinity has been used to discuss things like dogfighting, and a great deal of that literature is very interesting. And then there's also social dominance theory that adopts the approach that society is very hierarchical in nature, and perhaps animals fall somewhere in that hierarchy. It's not been adopted in the initial research for social dominance theory or social dominance orientation to include animals, but more and more they are being recognized as a component of that theoretical framework. So I wanted to focus on this idea of social dominance orientation. So the attitudes that an individual has with regard to their beliefs of hierarchy in society as a whole. So the belief is those individuals that have a high social dominance orientation do endorse a hierarchy in society, and they their belief systems enhance that hierarchy, and as a result they legitimize it. And so the opposite would be true for a low social dominance orientation. Legitimizing the way in which humans dominate non-human animals is not new to society, but with social dominance theory and social dominance orientation, it's allowed us to tap into the specific mechanism And it's been fairly helpful in studying oppressed groups from a human perspective. So using it to study non-humans is something that's up and coming in the literature. I wanted to focus on mascots. Mascots have a variety of linkages to your sport teams. Obviously, it's believed to be an extension of a team. They are symbolic in nature, believed to represent luck. There's a sense of nostalgia. People form attachments to them, and as such, form identities related to that. From an organizational standpoint, brand identity is something that brings in a great deal of income. And so attaching your team to a specific animal can actually enhance your brand and your team to some extent. And then, of course, they're also believed to help teams win, which is why many institutions, especially at the intercollegiate D1 level, have live mascots at their events. It's believed to be that it's luck to have them there, whereas I think the rest of us would say it's probably somewhat traumatizing for that animal to be there. So I wanted to focus on mascots because it really is not a whole lot of literature with regard to non-human animal mascots, which I found kind of strange, being that there are so many non-human animal mascots. But there's a great deal of literature looking at Native American mascots. And I'm not drawing parallels from a non-human animal to a human, but I wanted to assess the attitudes related to both to see if there was any relationship there. Because so much of the literature on Native American mascots, especially currently, focuses on the depiction of them and how it enhances stereotypes. And it very much falls in line with this belief of social dominance theory. So there's a hierarchy involved, and those individuals who support that hierarchy and legitimize that hierarchy are more likely to endorse attitudes that would support those stereotypes and those legitimizing myths. I have done some other research in non-human animal mascots. What I did specifically was I looked at endangered species mascots, and I wanted to see what the sport fans knew and if fan identity was related to wanting to help those endangered species at all. And it was. Those individuals with a higher sport fan identity wanted to learn more about helping those animals, which was a very exciting finding and definitely needs to be revisited. I did a little bit of research on the animals that do represent sport teams. I looked at NFL teams and just found a sizable percentage of sport teams that are represented by animal mascots. And then in your D1 institutions as well, there are quite a few. And with regard to these specific mascots themselves, there's a heavy mix of domestic and exotic animals, but the exotic animals tend to get more of the research attention as well as more of the attention from a help standpoint versus the domestic animals. And so that's something that future research can absolutely look at. And then this is just a map I pulled from one of my resources, and it kind of just visually depicts the way in which animals are in fact used quite heavily from a sport mascot perspective. And it's somewhat alarming given the lack of literature that is present. So the purpose of this research project was to look at social dominance orientation as it relates to attitudes toward animals in and out of sport. And what I did is I wanted to look at animals in and out of sport because I wanted to assess this specific context. So I had a series of hypotheses formed, and I am not a statistics guru, so I did the best I can, and there are probably additional ways to examine this data, and I'm open to suggestions on that in the questions. But for what I did, I put forth these hypotheses looking at social dominance orientation as it predicts attitudes toward animals, animals as mascots, and then animals in sport in general, which was somewhat interesting because I just wanted to do it blanketly across the board and not focus only on mascots. I also wanted to examine Native American mascots as it related to non-human animals in sport and as mascots as well. I wanted to see how those attitudes align. Not suggesting that the plight is exactly the same, but I wanted to get a feel of how that relates to social dominance orientation. And with purpose 3, I wanted to see what the role of sport fan identity was there as well. So I sought out IRB approval. The distribution of the survey itself was a Qualtrics survey, and there were a series of inventories. Looked at social dominance orientation, attitudes toward animal scale, which is Herzog's scale, fan identity, which was Bunn-Wanscombe, animals as mascots, animals in sport, and then Native Americans as mascots. And the Cronbach's alpha was very high for some of those scales, a little bit lower for others, but it was still within the range that was acceptable to use. And I used SPSS. Looked at demographic information. As you can see, the sample is very high in female representation, which is really not that uncommon when you look at the literature for attitudes toward animals. I believe that asking a general population to take part in a survey about animals voluntarily, you're going to get more females that want to do it versus your males. Granted, I don't have research to support that, but there are attitudes, there is research to suggest attitudes are more favorable among females. It was heavy in the Caucasian population as well. The age distribution was fairly substantial across the board. Younger populations perhaps were not as represented. And then regions in the United States, the Southeast was heavily represented. And then there were even some across the Western and Southwest United States as well. So I put together just the basic information for the scales. The mean score for the social dominance orientation was quite high. Attitudes toward animals, this was again Herzog's scale, and it represents favorable attitudes toward animals. So it's important to look at that when you look at the mean score. And then the standard deviations are presented as well. I provided the correlations because that is the first step in looking at regression. And so it was really interesting to me that sport fan identity and social dominance orientation were not correlated at all. That kind of blew up my hypotheses in a way, but it was actually really kind of fascinating because I think based on the assumption and the ideologies that we have in the sport context, we would believe that there are legitimizing myths that exist. And it was fascinating that those legitimizing myths didn't relate to sport fan identification, but I have some potential explanations for that. Sport fan identification also was not correlated with Native American mascots, which I thought was very interesting given the literature that exists with regard to Native American mascots. But the rest of the correlations are quite strong. I have the significance level down here. So they're all significant below a 0.01 level. So I did a series of linear regressions. The first one was looking at social dominance orientation and whether it predicted favorable attitudes toward animals. And there was a significant negative relationship there. So higher social dominance orientation, less favorable attitudes toward animals. Animals as mascots, interestingly enough, was it was not negative, but the survey itself was endorsing attitudes or animals as mascots. So there was a positive relationship, meaning that higher social dominance orientation meant that individuals did feel as though animals could and should be used as mascots. Same is true for endorsing animals in sport as a whole, also endorsing Native American mascots. And then the endorsement of Native American mascots also predicted the endorsement of animals as mascots. And that was a highly significant relationship there as well. So hypothesis 2B was pretty interesting from the standpoint of legitimizing myths when brought all together. Because it would suggest that perhaps the mechanism by which this occurs is social dominance orientation. The findings themselves, I'll jump down to the third purpose or the third hypothesis. I couldn't even run the regression analysis for sport fan identity because the correlation was not significant. So not having a relationship between sport fan identity and animals as mascots as one of the explanations for that, the mediating factor, was really interesting. And I'm a big believer in finding significance and non-significance. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But the other hypotheses were supported. So those suggesting that higher social dominance orientation did indeed predict the usage of animals within sport, animals as mascots, and a less favorable attitudes toward animals in general. And then the higher favorable attitudes of the Native American mascots and the animal mascots aligned as well. So sport fan identification, if I went back to the correlation chart, you'll see that it was related to favorable attitudes toward animals in general, which I think is fascinating. And it somewhat aligns with previous literature or previous research that I've done looking at higher sport identification relating to wanting to know more about endangered species mascots and what they could do to help. It also aligns with the most recent theoretical literature related to animals in sport, looking at them as part of the in-group or as part of the out-group. These findings would suggest that perhaps they are part of the in-group. If they are aligned with the team, if they are part of the team, and they are considered to be such because they represent the mascot and the team's mascot, perhaps they are a member of the in-group. And if that is the case, then we can use that in a variety of different ways to help these animals. And the implications of that are primarily geared towards sport organizations, but they're also geared toward individuals as well. Social dominance orientation, it kind of threw me, and granted the sample would have a great deal to do with this as well, but it does predict those attitudes as it relates to the endorsement of different sport mascots, but sport fan ID did not. So perhaps sport is a unique context in which the use of animals is not governed by social dominance orientation and governed by something else. What that other thing is, I'm not sure. It could tie back into in-group, out-group dynamic. It could tie into the hierarchical belief of things, but it's an exciting area for future research. And it really helped mobilize my interest in how to better explain this. If you look at a lot of the literature as it relates to the environment in sport, they've overlooked endangered species mascots. I know the Green Sport Alliance at one point had an initiative that they were going to put in place, but they pulled back on it. And so hopefully we can get something mobilized such that we can further examine these non-human animal mascots and look at them from the endangered species mascot and the non-endangered species mascot standpoint. This research also was very supportive from the standpoint of, it endorsed animal standpoint theory, which puts forth that you can't examine hierarchy in society as a whole without also including the role of animals in that hierarchy. Anthroparchy is very similar in regard to examining different social institutions and the way in which these social institutions exist in society as a whole. So there's marginalization, oppression, victimization, so on and so forth. And if we look at your underrepresented populations in the human realm, we can see that there are interesting parallels that can be drawn to the non-human realm. And then your more recent theoretical models looking at interspecies model of prejudice, attitudes are related, as demonstrated here, but the differences are definitely worth noting, and they may be worth noting from a social identity perspective. So looking at it from an in-group, out-group dynamic. The most notable takeaway from this research was the unique relationship that sport fan identification had with animals in sport. It has a positive relationship with attitudes toward animals as a whole. And it didn't predict what I thought it was going to predict. Those hypotheses were not supported with regard to animal mascots. And so that's an exciting area for future work, as I think that there might be something there that if it's not palpable and not 100% overt, perhaps there's something covert there that in-groups do represent, or animals can be part of those in-group dynamics, and therefore they can be supported by sport fans. So a few conclusions: social dominance orientation is related to those attitudes, not necessarily related to sport. There's some suggestions that perhaps because it was a general question of an animal mascot and not one specific animal mascot, that the findings are somewhat erroneous because it didn't tap into their specific identity or their specific beliefs about animal mascots themselves. But I do feel as though there is future research that can be done examining sport fans as they relate to advocates for animals. And this can be done both domestic and with regard to exotic animals. And that's it. Are there questions, comments?
Well, thank you very much, Melanie. That was excellent and absolutely fascinating. Would you please turn off sharing your screen so that we can see you?
Sure.
Yeah. Excellent. So the floor is open to questions at this point. And Jan has his hand up.
Melanie, I wonder if you might be able to expand a little bit on what the use of Native Americans and non-human animals as mascots entails, because I'm based in the UK. I'm not really familiar with this kind of thing.
Sure.
The mascots that I have in mind is the sort of people who dress up as all sorts of comical characters and who jump about on the side of the football pitch.
Sure.
And the second question is, could you say whether you think that the use of animals as mascots might ever be justified? Thank you.
Sure. I think we're actually moving toward the use of animals as mascots not being justified, unless they're very similar to in the United States, where we see Native American mascots being used for sport teams, but we see sport teams having a relationship with that specific Native American tribe. So the Seminoles, for example, at Florida State University, they have a relationship with the university, and they help that tribe, maintain their ethnic identity such that there aren't any misrepresentations, and there's some revenue sharing there as well, so they get some money in return. I would, if animals as mascots continues to thrive, I think there'll be some big changes from the standpoint of helping those animals. And I do think there will be the removal of live animals on campus. LSU is probably the worst example of that. They have Mike the Tiger, who lives on campus, and students can go up to it and they can take selfies, and he's standing behind them. And it's egregious, but I digress. And then in the United States, mascots tend to be used as a way to implicitly and subliminally represent what sport is. So your Native American mascots, they tend to be represented as savages, not having much compassion, very stereotypical in nature. And visually depicted, they tend to represent those same things. And that's also the case for animals. What they capitalize on is the predatory nature of those animals and those predatory characteristics. And so when they visually depict those animals, they tend to make it so they look vicious. And so that generally communicates that this team is vicious in nature, it's aggressive in nature. And to some extent, implicitly, there's this belief of killing and taking out one's opponent. And just a few years ago, the Carolina Panthers actually redid their Panther mascot because they didn't feel it was ferocious enough. So they made it more ferocious, and they wanted to make sure that that was their branding. It's all about branding.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. Any other questions? Perhaps I could ask you at this point, Melanie, could you just tell us a little bit more about the kinds of exotic animal mascots that where teams have live ones?
Sure. It's mostly tigers. And there are a few schools that have aligned themselves with a program called Tigers for Tigers, where they have student organizations and student clubs that work to help promote the plight of those tigers. But that's only in a few institutions. Your more exotic animals, it's going to be your tigers, your elephants. So Roll Tide has specifically to do with elephants. And they do have programs in place to help educate individuals about that population, but they don't necessarily make it so there's a big push to do so. Other exotic animals, not off the top of my head, but I know that it would be those where you could absolutely look at the endangered species mascot list and they would absolutely fall on there. That's not to say that domestic animals don't fall on there as well. But those are the ones individuals are more aware of, would be your exotic animals.
Right. Wow. That's really interesting to me. I hadn't realized that live tigers were used as
terrible
mascots. Wow.
Just as an odd note, Melanie mentioned it, the Alabama Crimson Tide actually refers to an algae bloom. The
Really?
Crimson Tide, so the red tide is an algae bloom that's red and comes in with the tide. So Crimson Tide literally refers to an algae bloom, but that's not very intimidating. So they switched it to an elephant.
They put an elephant with it.
Oddly, yeah. I'm sorry, Rebecca, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering, it's a really interesting presentation. I'm really interested in, this the whole idea of being able to measure someone's social dominance orientation. And I was just wondering how you do that. I mean, it's amazing that, there's the highest social dominance orientation, the less favorable attitudes towards animals are. And I was just wondering, this could tell us so much about other practices, not just using animals in sport. But how do would you be able to say a bit more about how you measure someone's social dominance orientation?
Sure. There's established inventories. And so this particular inventory I used has been tested in several populations, looking at how those dominant orientations or that dominance orientation is associated with their other belief systems. And so the survey itself, I can't remember how many questions it is, but it's been used enough times over that it's very reliable and very valid in what it does measure. And if I had it in front of me, and I apologize that I don't, I could read you some of the questions from it, and I'm happy to send that to you as well, because I do have the inventory. And what it really speaks to is the legitimizing myths. So do you feel that certain segments of the population deserve to be where they are? Those types of questions are on the inventory. And it's really kind of fascinating because people, you would think social desirability would inhibit people from answering those honestly, but it does not seem to do that. So anonymity is a pretty big advantageous thing here.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I'm just looking at the time and we are just over into our break. So Melanie, thank you so much for your presentation, for joining us.
Can I just be cheeky and ask Melanie if she could share her PowerPoint with us so that I can have a look at some of the references, because I didn't have time to write everything down.
Yeah. Well, I can email it to Sam or Gabriella. Is that okay? Okay, yeah. I'll do that.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Oh, and thanks, Ashish, for that about the football teams. Interesting.